Well, starting with the old hospital in Glebe, the old cottage hospital, that was opened in 1895, and it served Penrith very well, but by the 1930s the population had grown and the old hospital had become really out of date for the time, and the local people wanted to have a new hospital. The matron and the chairman of the board both thought a new hospital should be built on that same site. But there was a difference of opinion in the board. Mr. Hewitt and some others felt that really there should be a new site for the hospital. So this difference of opinion rather delayed things in the 30s, and the Hospitals Commission at that time also believed that it should be on the Glebe Place site. But by 1938, what we call the Jones site in Kingswood had become on the market for £550. It was 26 acres, and it was bounded by Somerset Street, Derby Street, Parker Street, and didn't go quite to the Western Highway. What we now know as Barber Avenue in those days was called Tyndale Street. So that was 26 acres for £550. And no, the hospital board weren't convinced it was the best site. A petition was got up in the local community, and 700 signatures said yes, we should go to the Jones site, as it was called. And the Hospitals Commission came out and looked at it and thought, oh well, perhaps. But people were writing letters to the paper, and one person wrote and said it was folly to build such an expensive building so far out of town. Of course, nowadays it seems ridiculous to say so far out of town when it's only at Kingswood, but in those days people didn't have motor cars like they do today, so they had to walk. Anyway, the whole thing was resolved because the health authorities decided that any new hospital would have to be built on an area not less than 5 acres, and the Glebe site was only 3 acres. Mr. Hewitt had invited the Deputy Minister of Health to come out in 1940 and have a look at the site, and he gave it the nod and said yes, that was the best site. So he rushed down to the solicitor and had the contract drawn up and straight away presented it to the hospital board. And they agreed, but they said on condition that Mrs. Jones would give them the extra 8¼ acres fronting the Western Highway, which made 32 altogether. And I think we should acknowledge the generosity of the Jones family in making this available. And on the contract, at the bottom of the contract, is a little typewritten note saying that they had agreed to give, or Mrs. Jones had agreed to give that 8¼ acres to the hospital. The money was raised by a Queen competition, Queen of the District competition, and they raised £1,500, and part of that went to buying the site. So, well, that really is how they came to acquire the Jones site.
first moved over, so we didn't have the staff really to cope with the bed state of the new hospital, and it took a while to get the staff all organised, the right numbers there. And I used to just fill in if necessary. I just did anything. If somebody forgot to come on duty at the right time, if it was a junior nurse, a senior nurse, or whoever it was, I just did it. Because the hospital had no entrance to the front with a ramp, and women have a habit of coming in labour rather quickly, and their husbands would sort of rush up, drive them up to the front entrance, and then they couldn't get them into the hospital because there were no steps there, and the matron's office was about the first place they came to when they jumped out of their car and rushed into the building to get somebody quick. And so, of course, matron was always off at weekends, and when anything's going to go wrong, it goes wrong at weekends. And so I'd have to tear outside, all dressed up in my uniform and flowing veil. And I remember they were in a utility truck with a running board. So I had to stand on the running board, and he had to drive right round to the back of the hospital to get this patient in very heavy labour into the hospital. Anyhow, we got her into the corridor of the main hospital, and I had to just deliver the baby there and then.
When we were training, matron and the registered nurses were the common enemy, and we lived in. I think that made a big difference. We all lived in the nurses' quarters, and so we were more like sisters to one another. I still look on these girls, we still call one another the girls, for goodness sake, these girls as sisters, and we'd go down in the evening when we were off duty and make a great big pot of tea and run the matron and the trained staff to the lowest. This was the way we'd cope with everything. We quite liked matron and the registered nurses, but they were the ones we could blame everything on, And it was a very bonding experience,
We didn't have any residents nor a medical superintendent when that hospital first opened.
Anyone wanting treatment, they'd have to come to me, and I'd have to fill in their details on a card, and then ask them to take a seat, and then I'd go in and tell the sister or whoever was around that they were there and waiting to be seen. And if I thought they looked very ill, I'd add that little bit. Tell them that they didn't look as though they'd be able to sit there too long.
If a patient came into emergency, we didn't have doctors there who were resident there. You couldn't just call someone like that. You had to ask them who their GP was. Then you had to try and get hold of the GP. And that wasn't always easy because, remember, no mobile phones, no answering machines, and a lot of people protecting their doctors, the secretaries that worked at their GPs. They didn't want to put you through unless it was really urgent.
So I was used to working in a city hospital where we were used to having residents, registrars and obstetricians on hand all the time. When I came to Nepean to work, we only had GPs who would come to visit their patients, so we had to make our own diagnosis and examine our patients, and we then had to ring the GPs to let them know how the patient was going. So we had to be very sure of what we were doing before we called the doctors in.
Between us all, we had this tremendous family of trust and understanding of doctors and staff, whoever it might have been, and colleagues to call on, staff to call on. This was after, I'm glad to say, there was the influx, slow influx of consultants that came into the area by way of specialists that I'll mention in a while that came on a part-time basis. But Harley Roberts and the wonderful Brian Sparrett, David Roxburgh and others all came into the obstetric world of practice in Penrith. And this 3 a.m. I needed help, and there was always one of them on call. And I rang, Brian Sparrett was on call. I said, Brian, I'm in strife with this obstructed labour. I've got a sick mother and a sick baby. Do you think you could help me? And he just said, John, I'll be there. In no time there he was in his tracksuit, at 3 a.m. in the morning. And the story is that after some time we ended up with a very, very distressed live mother and a live baby. It was very moving, and I said to Brian, thank you. I was there with this mother, her husband was on his way down, and I said, look, I'll get my secretary to ring through the details. She was an intermediate patient. I'll get my secretary to ring through the details tomorrow morning to your secretary of her name and address and all that sort of stuff. And he just put his hand on my shoulder, that lovely big man, he's about a foot taller than I am. John, forget it. It was a pleasure. And he walked out. It doesn't get any better, does it? That was Brian.
Nepean didn't have too many specialists, was all GPs, and GPs did surgery, delivered babies and did everything. And the only other allied health was physiotherapy when I arrived. We used to get a senior registrar and from Royal Prince Alfred Hospital and junior registrars from St Vincent's. I was there at the same time as Michael Knoll, who came as a junior resident from St Vincent's, and we worked closely because they were used to working with social work and allied health. So we always formed really good relationships with the residents.
My first 3 months as an intern was unsupervised in casualty, so it was really a baptism of fire, and it was the nursing staff really that helped me through that time. It was a fabulous learning ground because we saw just everything, and the visiting medical officers at that time would come in and help in casualty, you know, on weekends and things. It was everyone was there to help each other, and it was there was a great deal of mateship and camaraderie, and it was a really good time to be in Penrith.
We've been very successful in our teaching program here at Nepean, and not just in the teaching program, I think just demonstrating to the students that this is a successful hospital. And maybe they didn't want to come here as students, but when they saw what was happening out here and they saw the way that they were being taught, they saw the way that this place was being run, they started to feel part of the place. Well, then they wanted to come back as residents. I retired last October, and I don't miss work one little bit, I can assure you that. But when you've been at a place for 20 years, or when you've been in a system for 30 odd years, to suddenly cut yourself off is fairly difficult. And I was offered the opportunity to come back and do something for the hospital. And I've said, yeah, I'd love to come back, because I've still got an interest in the place. And there's still a lot of people around, of course, that I know and I've worked with. And the hospital's become part of me, and I've become part of the hospital, I suppose.
There was this sense of each of you wanting the other one to be good at what they do for the patient's sake. You know, it was...
There was a greater sense of belonging altogether.
Yeah.
Land around the hospital was used to fatten up steers, so and there would have been about 10 or 15 steers running around the hospital, and we did get up to some mischief one night when it seemed, I must say, it seemed like a really good idea at the time, but we found, I suppose we'd had a couple of sherbets and got a little bit excited, and we found a bit of rope, and we got out and we roped one of these steers and brought it in and put it in one of the girls' bedrooms, and unfortunately it made a terrible mess. It just made a terrible mess.
I didn't know who I was more frightened of, my mother or matron. And my mother rang me, she had a young baby, and she said, I want you to come home and mind Michelle. And I said, I haven't got a day off, Mum. And she said, you haven't had a day off for 3 weeks. And she said, you go and tell matron you want a day off. So, of course, I didn't know who to follow, so I said, oh, Mum will kill me if I don't get a day off. So I went to matron and put my hands behind my back and cast my eyes down, as we did in those days. And I said, my mother said to tell you I haven't had a day off for 3 weeks. And matron just looked me from head to toe and said, so?
We had no ambulance at Springwood. So I had a station wagon then. And many of the time I used to take patients down to Nepean Hospital. I'd ring them up, say, look, I'm coming, get this, that and the other ready. Okay, good. And I'd take them down cushions in the back of my station wagon. And because there was no ambulance. I mean, we made do that way. And
when a group school was instituted, of course this meant that we had intakes of about 50 nurses, and up until this time we had the school operating in just 2 classrooms. So there's no way we could fit all these nurses into the 2 classrooms. So temporarily we used the old laundry building, which was very noisy and hot and horrible. Then when the new maternity ward was enlarged, before the patients went in, we took over the top floor of the maternity hospital and used that as a school. And this was while we were waiting for our purpose-built school to be built. It was finally built, and the architecture reminded everyone of a Pizza Hut, so it was called the Pizza Hut by many people. It was a strange building. It had a well in the centre, and the offices and the classrooms centred round this well. I don't know why they built it like that. It did win, I think it won some award for building architecture, but it's built on clay, and there was some problem with the drainage, and every now and again in the first year that it was opened, the well would fill with rather horrible smelling water and had to be pumped out.
There were more specialists coming into the district to live here, and therefore the surgeons to have operating lists. There was more demand